Hello, friends. My name is Gabriel. This is Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I'm really excited to speak about an incredibly important and mildly controversial topic, namely the study of the Jesus of history. What can we really know as sort of critical academic scholars about the Jesus of history, and how do the claims of the Quran and the Bible compare to that knowledge? We have an expert in the field here, Father Anthony Giambrone, to discuss this with us. Father Giambrone, thanks for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
Delighted to have you here. Everyone, very brief introduction. Father Giambrone, who has a Notre Dame connection, by the way, is the Dominican priest of the province of St. Joseph and professor of New Testament and vice director of the École Biblique, which is in Jerusalem. And I guess right near the Damascus Gate, Father?
Exactly, right outside the old city walls.
Okay, yeah, terrific. So, he's a perfect scholar to address this topic with us because he has extensive studies that are all put together in a really important volume that we'll certainly link to in the description, entitled A Quest for the Historical Christ, Scientia Christi and the Modern Study of Jesus, that was published in 2022. We're going to get right into some of the big questions about the Jesus of history. But first, just could you sort of tell us a little bit about life in Jerusalem, life in the Holy Land? You have your Dominican priestly clothes, habit on. Do Palestinians and Israelis recognize you that as a priest? And how do they react? What is life as an American priest in Jerusalem like?
Sure. It's certainly interesting. It's an extraordinary place to be. It's sometimes a difficult, always a kind of passionate place to live. I tell people usually sometimes it's the end of the world, sometimes it's the center of the world. Christians, you mentioned the habit. Christians have a curious, ambiguous status, I'd say. Sometimes very visible, sometimes very invisible. The religious, the pilgrims, the holy sites are obviously very visible, and so the Dominicans are a recognizable part of the landscape. You see the Franciscans, everyone knows them. You see the Dominicans, and you're greeted with an abuna, or sometimes there's enough who studied at the French schools. They speak to you in French. The old Palestinian Christians still speak a lot of French. So
Abuna's father in Arabic dialect, right?
exactly. So there's a kind of acknowledgement and respect that's shown. You get spit on sometimes in the Jewish quarter if you walk in the wrong place. That's part of the experience too. That's intensifying actually recently. So there's tensions as well. But Christians in some ways have more freedom, I'd say, than either the Jews or the Muslims in Jerusalem itself, to kind of float back and forth. I have friends both in East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem who won't go to the other side, but we have a kind of freedom to move around, and in that sense, we're sometimes in some way kind of outside the lines of battle, which is a happy freedom to have.
Yes, yes. Okay, Father or Abuna, turning right to a question that I often hear, often from Muslims about the Gospels. The Gospels are written in Greek. Muslims will sometimes point out that Jesus did not speak in Greek. That he spoke in Aramaic. I know there's a kind of a subfield of the whole historical Jesus debate about whether he might have known some Greek, maybe because obviously, Jews were thinking even in religious terms in Greek at this time and place. But it still seems strange. Jesus spoke in Aramaic. Why are the Gospels in Greek?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a few ways to come at this. In the first case, it is important not to underestimate how present the Greek language was in Palestine, in Jerusalem, in this period. So not just with the Romans, but already beginning in the Hellenistic period before that, you have waves of Greek-speaking rulers in the period. So, we find, most of our inscriptional evidence and so forth from this time and place is actually in Greek. They had more of an epigraphical habit. That's part of what that is. But it's very, very pervasive. So it's not just possible. It's actually very likely that Jesus, like most of his contemporaries, would have at least a bit of Greek just to function.
Okay.
Even like today, it's
Okay, it's
very
very interesting to hear that. Yeah, it was even likely. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I think the majority of scholars would accept that today as the kind of linguistic circumstance that it's polyglot, diglot, maybe triglot. So actually that touches even this question of Aramaic and Hebrew, because increasingly there's a lot of evidence that Hebrew was also still a living language. And so it's probably the case that there's a lot of movement between Hebrew, Aramaic, and
Mhm,
Greek,
mhm,
um,
mhm.
within
So
a
triglot meaning three languages, Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew, could all have been spoken in first century Palestine.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So that's the circumstance. You obviously have also a kind of Hellenistic Judaism outside of the Holy Land, in Asia Minor, in Egypt, and that has a lot to do with the fact that the Gospels and the entire New Testament is composed in Greek, is because it's largely oriented to this kind of diasporic context.
Well, but Abuna, how does that fit with, I don't know, a common notion that, the gospel authors still, and Jesus himself, they were concerned with kind of the local Jewish. I mean, I don't know, maybe the notion is just completely wrong, but
Yeah,
you hear this. I mean, the orientation was towards Jews, not to Gentiles. The initial concern was Palestine. It's only Paul that got worried about Jews further afield. I mean, yeah,
sure. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, we can distinguish between Paul, who has these missions. I mean, all the way into Europe and so forth, which is a kind of distinct thing. But the Gospels themselves also need to be differentiated. So, I mean, we have four Gospels, three
right.
that are called the Synoptics, and all of them are written in different contexts, and for
Okay.
different
Okay.
groups. But for instance, on exactly that point, the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, there are very old traditions. Papias is an early Christian author who informs us there's actually a kind of earlier version of Matthew that
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
written. We don't actually know if he means in Hebrew or in Aramaic, but some sort of Semitic original. Whether that's the exact form of Matthew that we have today and it's translated, or kind of a core of it, that's disputed, and even whether that that testimony is correct or not is a little disputed. What you can see though is in the Greek of Matthew, if you compare it to the Greek of Luke, for instance, is that it's much more of what we would call Semitic interference. So it's someone thinking in a Semitic language and writing
It's very interesting.
in Greek. Like when I speak French, I mean, you can tell I'm an Anglophone. Just the way you use a preposition here and there and so forth. So that same phenomenon
Mhm, mhm. So you
comes
can
through.
detect that in Matthew, that there's sort of Aramaicisms or even Aramaic, maybe modes of thought. That might be a bit sketchy. I
Exactly.
don't know, but
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, there's a
yeah.
kind of transparency in that way to the Semitic mindset. Turns of phrase, patterns of thought, and so forth that are more or
Mhm,
less
mhm,
perceptible, and that has something to do also with the context in which Matthew is writing. That gets a little bit speculative, but a widely accepted
mhm,
hypothesis
mhm.
is that Matthew's being written in Syria, which itself is an even more Hellenized Semitic context. And so,
Okay,
in that
okay,
kind of a milieu, it's natural that we get this kind of a text. So,
okay.
I mean, you
Two
have
two quick. So
no, no,
go
please.
ahead. Sorry.
Well, no,
Well, I
no,
was going to ask two quick follow-up questions. One is, I mean, there's this tradition by this very early, Christian figure, Papias, which I think may actually be reported by someone else. It doesn't matter. But there's this tradition around that there was this proto version of Matthew that was in Aramaic or Hebrew or something. But just to be clear, we've never found sort of a primitive Aramaic language gospel manuscript.
no, no. So, as I say, it's even a little disputed whether that tradition is reliable or not. What exactly it
Mhm, mhm,
means? It
mhm.
Some people think it might refer to a kind of oral tradition. scholars talk about a hypothesis of a saying source that informed um, the
Right.
the Matthew and Luke. It's also a little bit disputed, but it's been connected with that tradition of a kind of early Aramaic collection of sayings, something like that. So there's different possibilities, but there's no manuscript that we have. Every single text that we have is in Greek, and it's the texts of Matthew are, for all practical purposes, exactly what we have today. There's minor variations, but we don't have a kind of primitive edition that's
Yeah, that
substantially
sort of
different than what we have
yeah,
now.
shook the foundations of what we think Matthew, primitive Matthew would have
Right,
looked
right.
like. But I mean, could you also, Father, set the scene a bit more in terms of languages? I mean, the kind of vague notion I have, and I think most people have, is if you actually were on the ground in Palestine, first century Palestine, everyone would be speaking Aramaic. You probably remember the movie by Mel Gibson, Passion of
Hmm.
the Christ. I
Hmm.
mean, all the local people are speaking Aramaic. And then, the Roman soldiers are speaking Latin. I've heard that even might be wrong, but it doesn't matter right now.
Hmm.
So everyone's speaking Aramaic. And then I guess people would say, well, I mean, at some point, the gospel authors just said maybe in order for their message to be more widely disseminated, let's just do it in Greek, but it's kind of just a totally different thing. But it sounds like Greek, you might have heard Greek if you were in the streets of Nazareth or Jerusalem. There could have been local Jews speaking some Greek.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we can doubt it really. And there's
Okay.
there's a lot of dimensions to this, but like I say, the waves both. I mean, the Greco-Roman. I mean, first the Hellenistic, but then also the Roman. The influence of Roman culture is very, very profound, and it reaches very deep. I mean, just to give one passing example, Jerusalem's a big metropolis. We know that we have Roman presence there, but even in Galilee, in a very small town, Bethsaida, which is where the disciples Peter and Andrew come from, there are excavations going on right now, and what we found are first century Roman baths. So you think of this as kind of a backwater or Semitic fishing village, and what you have is the deep penetration of a kind of ecumenical, that is imperial culture that's pan Mediterranean, that's reached into the very backyard of the early Christian community. So I think that kind of a context, that kind of a material context, also helps us understand and appreciate how
Yes.
pervasive this linguistic culture also was.
And I mean, there are implications, I think, of those sort of discoveries and just the increase in appreciation of the spread or the presence of Greek in first century Palestine, because I mean, there is this notion out there, which I know has a whole legacy within debates around the Bible and historical Jesus research. I assume that, true Christianity, primitive Christianity, was Semitic and then was basically corrupted by Hellenization, not just in terms of language, the process of translating an original pure message into another language, but also in terms of theology, that, like this strange philosophical ideas of Greek thinkers sort of, basically are responsible for Christian ideas of the Trinity, of the divinity of Christ, or maybe of,
Mhm.
the Chalcedonian formulation, which we don't have to get into right now. But I'm
Mhm.
sure you're familiar with all this. So, I mean, it sounds like it's just more complicated. You can't just say there's a Semitic phase and then a Hellenized phase.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it is more complicated. There's a landmark study that, I mean, it's going back more than a generation now, by a scholar named Martin Hengel, who really kind of changed the paradigm on this strict division between Palestinian Semitic and Hellenistic pagan, and it's just called Hellenistic Judaism, and it's a very um, comprehensive chronicling of just the depths of the penetration, the kind of undeniable penetration of this culture, including I mean, with the language comes patterns of thought, philosophical patterns of thought, these sorts of things. So yeah, I think we need to break down that kind of a dichotomy, which
Yes.
is
Yes.
inaccurate and unhelpful.
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. And then turning to the Gospels finally, I mean, we should turn to sort of all the resources that we have in historical Jesus scholarship, but I mean, that would be a huge question if I just,
Mm.
led with that. So if we just start with the Gospels and, maybe you tell me actually, Paul or something else is actually more useful than the Gospels for historical Jesus scholarship. But anyway, I mean, if we start with the Gospels, you mentioned in the so-called canon of the New Testament. So, what Christians recognize as scripture. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as synoptic gospels. So, I mean, could you, in very broad terms, just introduce us to how someone interested in the question of historical Jesus goes about sort of working with the gospels?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's different people have different approaches on this. I mean, there's been a kind of classic, I'd call it a prejudice, but a preference for the Synoptic Gospels as
Mhm.
the kind of base for a reconstruction of the history of Jesus. There are reasons for that. John's Gospel stands outside and has very different, much more reflective, symbolic manner of presenting the life of Jesus. More recent scholarship and a decision was kind of made in the 19th century in a German context to make that also a kind of fork in the road, that you decide either for the synoptics and against John, or and the decision was for that. That has been revisited in the last generation as well. And John's gospel is also, I think, today certainly by quite a few recognized as a pretty important, even invaluable source and complement to the picture that we get from the synoptic gospels. Um, there are different dimensions to that. One is the claim to eyewitness that's connected with John's gospel. That's a discussion in itself, and we can pursue that if you'd like. But just to give some examples of that, I mean, there's a lot of detail that appears, topographical detail, for instance, about sites, locations that appears in John's gospel that's not characteristic of the style of the synoptics. And it's extraordinary here again, just by the measure of archaeology or verisimilitude, which isn't a proof, but it's a kind of congruence with what we know. The city.
And verisimilitude here means, does this basically match what we know about like the culture and historical context? And
Exactly, exactly. I mean, so back to the languages, for instance, the sign on Jesus' cross is written in three languages, even like the signs in Jerusalem today, this polyglot kind of context. Um, but for instance, it's very striking that John's gospel is very frequently structured around the symbol of water, and that has to do with particular locations in Jerusalem of these public pools. This happens to be something that's, in the last 5 years, actually, it's pretty recent, but there's been a lot of archaeology done about the water systems in first century Jerusalem. And it has a water culture that's like absolutely unique in the Middle East and even in the Roman Empire. And it has everything to do with mass pilgrim traffic. So the Jewish pilgrimage to the temple had taken on such a scope with Herod's rebuilding of the temple. I mean, there's economic dimensions of this, but infrastructure dimensions, that the city itself was being reconstructed simply to meet the water needs of all of these people. And so it's absolutely a perfect fit. It could be invented, but it's a perfect fit that Jesus is constantly going to Jerusalem on pilgrimage and showing up at these sites of water, which were designed as the kind of gathering place for the pilgrims. So there's these kinds of ways that John gives us a very vivid, but also a remarkably accurate picture. We don't have the same kinds of issues. For instance, Old Testament scholars have to fight with different issues of archaeology and accuracy. In the New Testament, it's almost embarrassingly easy sometimes of how well
okay,
the evidence and the texts fit together.
yeah. I mean, and the upshot of this particular point is I mean, you can't just set aside John. So you
No,
have the Synoptic Gospels, but maybe an older style of scholarship was, well, they were written probably before John, and therefore those are the ones that actually count. But
right.
actually, when you examine John, you find sort of more primitive material that can be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, I mean, we get material there that we don't get in the other texts, and so get a fuller picture and a necessary part of the picture.
Okay, and then turning, I mean, just I don't know if you maybe want to pick out a case study, but I mean, what are some of the basic ways, like, if you were teaching there at the École Biblique in Jerusalem or somewhere else, kind of introduction to historical Jesus studies, what would be some of like the things on day one that you would say, in regard to working with the Gospels, like, what are some principles or what are examples of elements in the Gospels where you would say, yeah, this has the signs of something primitive, historically verifiable, and that does not.
Yeah, I mean this is obviously, I mean, there's a big prolegomena. There's lots of discussion about the right methods here. I mean, if it's my class and I'm on the first day, I mean, I certainly would talk about this question of miracles, for instance. So this is basic to the way that contemporary scholarship does history or doesn't do history. This also, you have to do a lot of historiography, kind of the history of scholarship to
Mhm.
understand where we are and why we think the way we think. But this too, a lot of this goes back in the case of historical Jesus scholarship to 19th century German presuppositions, and a lot of decisions were made, philosophical decisions were made about what's possible and what's not possible. And that obviously becomes a filter by which you're going to kind of sift through and say these things can happen, these things can't. So I think it's important to flag at the beginning just non-historical questions, philosophical or religious questions, and the presuppositions, the answers that we bring to those questions as we're
Very
going to approach,
important.
because
Yes.
the Gospels
Yes.
are filled with supernatural events, and so it's going to make a big difference. And if you come to this with a materialistic naturalist philosophy, you're not going to find a lot that you're going to be happy with in the Gospels. That's a big challenge.
I mean, isn't there, Abuna, just, I mean, a whole industry of books that have been written now, probably TikTok videos, of folks who are saying, oh, I'm going to demythologize all the gospel stuff and I'm going to get to, the real man. And, step one is just casting off anything supernatural. And people have made a lot of money selling books like that.
Right, and they've been made a lot of money for a long time. I mean, this is the story that goes back into 19th century, D.F. Strauss and these sorts of guys who, I mean, they're at the very beginning. In fact, this is one of the earliest Life of Jesus books in 1835, 36, two big fat volumes, and it's basically an attempt to say that it's all mythology, that there's no actually history behind it. It's religious myth making, and maybe it has a kind of religious meaning insofar as myths have meaning, but it doesn't have. There's no historical substance behind it.
Do some folks who have this kind of style deny that there was actually a Jesus? Do they say the figure is completely created? Jesus never existed?
Yeah, so that's a kind of, I mean, outlier, extreme position, but one that keeps recurring. It's a provocation, and I mean, the vast mainstream through through the centuries doesn't accept the Jesus myth theory, that Jesus himself was a myth. So you'll have those who think, okay, there was a Jesus, but he's not the figure that we see in the Gospels. You have some who don't think there was a Jesus, but that's a very rare. I mean, beyond improbable. It's wrong. I mean, I think um, that's just an impossible
Yeah.
theory to maintain. But it's a theory that sells books and does keep coming back.
And then circling back, I mean, I don't know, before other questions, long list of questions, but I want to give you a chance if you want to add anything more about kind of that scenario, day one in the
Mhm.
classroom. So you would mention there is this whole history of scholarship. There are presuppositions, naturalistic presuppositions that would immediately cast out anything supernatural. I mean, is there something else that might be important to get out there right at the beginning about how to work with the Gospels?
Yeah, so one of the key figures in the history of scholarship is a guy named Albert Schweitzer, famous, won a
Mhm.
Nobel Prize, missionary in Africa and so forth. But he identified these three kind of big binary decisions, and I think it's a helpful way to get into the question. So this binary that we talked about of synoptics versus John, there I think we need to reject the forced choice. I think that is also going to configure the way that we come to the question. Um, he is very insistent. This is a little bit more technical, but about the question about Jesus' eschatology. He ultimately has the idea that Jesus is a failed Messiah, and so what's critical here. He says either we need to assent to thoroughgoing skepticism or thoroughgoing eschatology, and for him that means a deluded Messiah. Um, Behind this, I think what he's insisting on that's right is thoroughgoing skepticism can't be the right answer, and the messianic consciousness of Jesus is the right answer. But I think the way that
So
we
can I jump in, Abuna? I'm sorry, I know it's horrible of me, but just to explain the idea of eschatology and failed Messiah. His idea basically is, Jesus wanted to start a revolt, he failed, so he took some comfort in the idea that God will come and punish his enemies.
Um, I mean, that's a variation on the theme. I mean, Schweitzer's
Okay,
particular idea is Jesus thinks the world's going to end. It's not ending, like catastrophic collapse of the universe, end of
right.
time space continuum. It doesn't happen, and so to trigger it, he throws himself on the cross, and nothing happens. So Schweitzer doesn't even
Okay,
believe in
okay,
the
okay,
resurrection. It's a variation. I mean,
okay.
there's a lot of different versions of this. You also have the Jesus kind of zealot rebel manifestation, which is a little bit
Reza
more
Aslan wrote a book about that.
exactly. So that also just has a long history. It kind of doesn't go away. It's difficult, honestly, to defend when you get into the details about it. But what I want to say here, and it is an important contribution of Schweitzer, even if I think it ultimately kind of goes in the wrong direction. It's that whole generation that saw it, though, is that, I mean, we do need to read Jesus in the light of what we call apocalyptic literature, or the eschatology of the Judaism of the period. Okay, and that brings us a little bit back to this question of, a Palestinian or a Hellenistic variation of
Mhm,
Judaism. So
mhm.
what we have now that they didn't have, in the 19th century is the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, and there we have a very an extraordinary deposit of texts that give us a tremendous window into the mentality and also the theology and this eschatology, in that sense of, I mean, the expectations of the Jews of the period. And so trying to fit Jesus within that matrix is a very important challenge.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I think it's something that that we can and do need to do, and that too is the kind of mainstream of Jesus scholarship. Is okay, we can say real things about him. We don't need to descend into absolute skepticism, but how we plot him within that framework of Jewish eschatology in the first century is a very delicate question, and there are too, I think, we can make a lot of mistakes. A
Yes,
lot of mistakes have been made, but it's a challenge. But it's not as though we're without data. So that's
yes,
another day one kind of question is
yes, yes.
how do we plot Jesus within the context of eschatology, and how do we articulate his sense of himself as Messiah?
Mhm,
That I think is really critical to getting this right, and that comes back to this issue of John and the Synoptics, because if we pull John out, then we're going to get a distorted picture about Jesus' self-perception. My thought on that, I mean, there's a lot of places where John and the synoptics are certainly in sync. It's not just a kind of complementary or oppositional relationship. And one of the things that we see very, very strongly in both contexts is Jesus' strong sense, articulate, overt sense that he is fulfilling the prophecies of the Old Testament. And I think that is an essential key, really, to get into the heart of this notion of messianic consciousness and how he understands himself within God's plan. God's plan for the
Really
world.
interesting. Yes, the Quran refers to Jesus as a Messiah. I mean, as you probably know, the Arabic word it uses is Masih, which is cognate with the Hebrew word for Messiah. So yeah, it'll be interesting to think more or to introduce more the concept. What did Messiah mean in a first century context? I think I want to turn, if it's okay, just to a specific example from the Gospels. I mean, you don't have to do something so crass as say thumbs up, it's historical, thumbs down, it's not. So
Right.
however you want to approach the question, but even if one has a religious disposition that allows for supernatural events, nevertheless, so if you keep, in the conversation, supernatural stuff, I mean, there must be other things, other ways of sort of looking at something and say, okay, this is more allegorical or something. I mean, theologically, I'm not sure exactly what you do with it, but
Right.
let's take the nativity stories that are found in Luke and Matthew, not in Mark, in John, as far as I know, unless there's sort of hints further on in the Gospels or something about that. But, they're basically in Luke and Matthew, much longer in Luke, I think, than in Matthew. Yeah, and they place the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, not in Nazareth. I think it's Matthew who has the visit of the three magi or wise men. Sometimes in lore, I don't know how this came to be. I don't think it's in the text. The three kings. We have a song about that. And obviously there's supernatural things as well with angels in heavens and shepherds and things like that. So, but I mean, how do scholars approach that? Does everyone say, like, this is unbelievable, Jesus must have been born in Nazareth, and that the whole thing about wise men coming from the east is just mythology? Could you speak a little bit about the nativity accounts?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, this is a kind of special problem within the bigger context. I mean, the public life of Jesus has a different set of witnesses. I mean, the disciples are there and so forth, and so how we can understand that we're
That's
getting
an
this
important point.
material is immediately less problematic than the case of the nativity account. So where the material comes from is an initial question that's often posed, or a difficulty that's posed, and there's no doubt that we find motifs that we recognize. So there's ways in which Matthew is painting Jesus as a kind of new Moses and so forth, and drawing in these ideas that Jesus is fulfilling the scriptures, and that's
Interesting.
scripturalized account. I mean, that's a technique. We need to be careful. Again, I mean, thumbs up, thumb down. I mean, the judgment that we have a narrative technique that is drawing upon traditional accounts, Old Testament accounts, something like that, doesn't prove or disprove the historicity of something. I mean, if you look, for instance, at Eusebius' history of Constantine, he does the exact same thing. He scripturalizes these accounts and finds ways in which prophecies are being fulfilled. It's a technique. We don't
Or
say.
if, I mean, maybe a more pop culture reference, if we watch the Napoleon movie that was released maybe last year, I forget exactly when, I never saw it, and something is like, not exactly accurate, it doesn't mean that, Napoleon didn't try to invade Russia in 1812 or
Well,
whatever.
exactly. So there we've got an even bigger stream of things about historicity, and I think that's actually a worthwhile point to make. That's not day one of the historical Jesus class. I did that in foundations,
Okay.
with the Exodus or something. So I use the Battle of Lepanto. So the Battle of Lepanto is a key moment in history of the Christian West, and you have the archival evidence of that. You have the letters of Don Juan of Austria. You have those kinds of texts. Then you have a text like G.K. Chesterton has this magnificent poem where Don Juan is a giant walking, striding over the globe. This kind of magnificent hero. You have the Louis de Wohl historical novel where they're inventing all of these conversations. None of them mean that the battle didn't happen. They're all projecting it, in mythological or poetical or historiographical registers. And we can do the same thing, and we need to be sensitive enough to understand that our text can also come through in these different literary registers. And even if the three synoptic gospels, all belong to a similar kind of literary genre, there's also nuances that we can recognize. So between Matthew and Luke, for instance, there's a significant difference. We talked a little bit about the kind of more Semitic context of Matthew. It's very natural that he's using these biblical ways of talking. Luke's nativity account is consonant with Luke's entire project, which is much more implanted in a Gentile public or for a Gentile audience. And one of the reasons Luke is particularly important for historical Jesus studies, and why the writing the Gospels in Greek is also important, is that there's a tradition of historiography in the Hellenistic world. So there's actually a strong, dating back to Herodotus and Thucydides, but a cultivated notion of scientific history, a kind of tested history. And Luke's prologue, at the beginning of his gospel, belongs to this type of literature. It signals to the reader that I'm entering into a historical account where someone has done research and gone through this. And when you measure Luke's account against that kind of Hellenistic and historiographical grid, it's actually very interesting what he does and what he doesn't do. So we have, in fact, we have an old text called "How to Write History" by Lucian of Samosata. So we actually know some of the rules, not just inductively, but positively, that historians of the period followed. And one of the things that they did and that they're told to do is when you encounter a myth, you take distance from it. So you say, it's told that, or it's recounted that, the people say that, and then you tell the myth. And so it's very, very striking, particularly when you see the proximity of Luke to a lot of these kind of historiographical moves, that in his nativity account, when he recounts the virgin birth of Jesus, he doesn't go into the they said rhetoric, or he doesn't say it's reported that. He doesn't use any of these kind of normal triggers that would distance himself as a historian. It's very clear, I think, from that and other indications that he's deeply invested in the historical reality of what he's recounting. He's not just giving us a Jewish version, for instance, of the birth of Augustus. Some people think that what we have there is clearly a way in which Jesus is entering into a kind of rivalry with Augustus in Luke's account. There's a different claim on imperial lordship, so that's at work. But that's also part of a narrative technique that doesn't mean that everything he's recounting is an invention, calculated to promote, some sort of theopolitical agenda. So I think that's the way we need to read those nativity accounts, is with a sensitivity to the type of literature that we have, and an understanding
almost to the craft of writing history at that time. And
exactly. And that just requires us reading a lot of old texts to know what they looked like at that time, and to see these gospel texts in their proper context.
I think it's going to be impossible to sort of cover all the big topics in this chat. Maybe I can convince you to do a second episode, but I want to at least address briefly, first, the notion of apocryphal gospels. What are these apocryphal gospels? and then hopefully we can say something about Paul as well, and using Paul. So, but first with the Apocryphal Gospels, I mean, now
Sure.
and then there's a sensational. I mean,
Right.
it used to be when people read magazines, maybe they still do, but there would be a Newsweek issue right before Easter or something,
Right.
or Time magazine, National Geographic or something about some gospel of Judas or someone that,
Right.
so Judas was a good guy, or, I don't know where Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code got his idea of
Right.
Jesus marrying Mary Magdalene, but like something like that, right?
Right.
And they'll say, you guys have all been duped by the authority, by the institutional church or something, in
Right.
thinking that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell you the real Jesus. We've actually just found in Egypt or somewhere, in
Right.
some hidden place that somebody found. Now we know it's in Coptic or whatever. So, I mean, could you just kind of give us a straight, spill the tea, give us a straight story about, is there important information in these so-called apocryphal gospels? I think I know two things about them. You can correct me. One, none are actually gospels in the sense of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're mostly little traditions, one after another, or sayings, one after another. And two, that all of these are later than all of the four canonical gospels. So I don't know if you want to start there, but yeah, just help us understand better these apocryphal gospels.
Yeah, I mean it's an important question. I mean, again, this sells books, but there's a fair amount of clarity. I mean, where you ended there, we can start. This question of the dating is pretty critical. So, with the exception of the Gospel of Thomas, which I'll come back to, basically all of them
Okay.
are very late texts. Some of them, I mean, you can feel. I mean, this comes back to reading old literature. I mean, if you read, Victor Hugo, and you compare that to, a 20th century novel, you can tell that you belong to a different world. Like, we don't write sentences that long anymore. And you can feel that also when you compare the apocryphal gospels and the canonical gospels. Like, these belong to completely different epochs and styles of literature. And the canonical gospels are first century texts, maybe spilling into the very early second century, but they belong to a very different epoch and style of writing. The apocryphal gospels are largely the sort of thing. A good example, I haven't actually seen it, but everyone tells me about The Chosen, which is this kind of recent retelling of the gospels. And the technique is that you fill in all the gaps. Okay, and so you give names to people who don't have names, and you give the background history to people that you want to know more about.
More
That's
stuff on in the apocryphal gospels of Jesus as a young boy, and
exactly. We want to know more. Like, what was it like? It's that kind of an instinct, that drives it. So it's an understandable kind of storytelling instinct that you want to do. So there's a lot of that. Some of it though becomes very, very fanciful. So it's a little different than the Chosen, at least as I understand it, and the kind of tastes and things that they found entertaining, or edifying, or disedifying, in largely. I mean, they start in the second century, but they go on, third, fourth, fifth century. Some of these are very, very late, so they're claimed to have, very primitive, extra canonical traditions that the church has suppressed is weak and I mean non-existent. The church didn't accept these because they weren't the authoritative and original best text. In some cases, they weren't even around yet. The Gospel of Thomas is a kind of case
okay,
apart, and it's a peculiar text, as you say. It's not really a gospel in the sense that we understand it as a narrative. So it is just a string of sayings. They're very it's a very controversial text, and the present thinking on it is that it's a kind of rolling composition. It's very similar to what I mentioned earlier, this notion of a saying source. So sometimes people talk
mhm.
about Q or the saying source.
Q.
It looks
Mhm.
it looks like that kind of it is that kind of a piece of literature. So we know that these kinds of things existed, but it's also clear that at least elements of this text are also late and belong to very, very different, hermetic, kind of secret, mystery
Okay. Okay.
initiation
Has that dimension.
in in feel. So
Yeah.
there's some questions about
Not
what.
just practical advice, more like secret, even mystical wisdom
Yeah,
about the
yeah,
true
yeah, exactly.
existence and. Mhm.
Exactly. And there's weird things there. I mean, kind of riddles and things that show up in there, kind of like a you know Buddhist puzzle or something like this. So
Okay.
there's
Okay.
there's there's that aspect to it, which is divergent with the material that we do know from first century Jewish context. So we are plotted in a kind of another religious world. But there are maybe some sayings that come through there that you know don't appear in the canonical gospels, but that do reflect earlier traditions. That's kind of debated. As a complete entity, though, it belongs to another period, and it clearly knows the synoptic gospels. That's
Okay.
the key thing too. Is it's already a kind
Okay.
of harmonization that of Matthew and Luke, for instance, that therefore is secondary to, dependent upon the earlier evidence of the synoptics.
Okay. Okay. And then very briefly, can we touch on Paul? I mean, I'm sure we could have a
Yeah.
whole episode on Paul and Jesus. But I mean, it's interesting for me and probably for a lot of viewers on this channel because, the overall disposition of Islamic tradition to Paul is very hostile in the classical sources and still today. I mean, there are plenty of dawah Islamic sort of proselytizing or evangelizing videos out there about, Paul is the true creator of Christianity. We don't have
Mm-hmm.
to go into the theology of and the Christology of Paul,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, just in terms of the historical Jesus question,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, how can Paul be used? I mean, Paul himself says that he only knew the risen Christ in this experience on the way to Damascus, and not the Jesus or the Christ before then. So, but is there still stuff in there that's useful for understanding the Jesus of history?
I mean, it's famously the case that I mean the quote unquote Jesus traditions or Paul are not numerous. So notions like kingdom of God are present, but not as prominent as in the preaching of Jesus. And we get
Okay.
a couple kind of sayings which seem to point back to. I mean, at the end of Romans, it seems like he's talking about render to Caesar. There's a couple of these kinds of things that seem to be floating in the background, but it's not so on the surface, obviously, as in the Gospels, which is why in terms of a kind of full reconstruction, the Gospels are the central and indispensable sources. I mean, the most critical thing is the resurrection, and this gets us back to those initial kind of premises, like what are the things that are possible, what are the things that are even subject to historical investigation. So, for instance, I mean, I was a student of him there at Notre Dame, but Father John Meyer, in his project, makes a very firm distinction. So, on the one hand, we can study, historically speaking, the public life of Jesus up to the crucifixion, but the resurrection isn't something that we can talk about historically. And I think this is where Paul's significant. Like, how do I explain Paul as a phenomenon? Paul is also derivative of Jesus, of an experience of Jesus. How do we get to this invent? I mean, I don't dissent to that, but I think it brings us. I think if we exclude Paul from the picture, then we get ourselves in the difficult position of not being able to explain Christianity itself. And the risen Jesus is the link, obviously, between whatever Paul is doing in trying to convert the whole world, and doing this in a way that does engage Hellenistic notions of philosophy. It's already there in the letters. It's not just outside the Bible. It's in Paul. But how do we get from Jesus to that? Through his resurrection. And so I think that the phenomenon of Christianity, and Paul represents this in very substantial way, is part of the problem of the historical Jesus. And so
Yes.
the problem of explaining Paul is its own issue. I think that's not always faced in a kind of forthright way. There's
Mhm.
a lot of historical Jesus scholarship that explains away Christianity, or that doesn't allow us a base to to um, to satisfyingly offer an explanation of the phenomenon of the expansion of Christianity in the first generation. So I
Very
think
interesting.
that's where we'd
Yeah.
plug it in.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. Just to clarify a bit, you referred to John Meyer, who worked here at Notre Dame, former colleague, and you worked with him when you were here at Notre Dame. Has a multi-volume work, really landmark work, I think, A Marginal Jew, about the historical Jesus. And I mean, I think you were kind of alluding to something that you mentioned in your book, A Quest for the Historical Christ, namely that, Professor Meyer refers to an idea of an, I don't know where he got this term. Maybe unpapal conclave. That's a term, right?
That's what he says. Yeah.
Yeah, where you get maybe a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, and an atheist all together. You lock them in a room somewhere. I think he told me at Harvard. I think he liked to imagine Harvard for some reason. And they can't come out until they establish what they can agree about in regard to the historical Jesus. So
Right.
but it sounds like that vision could actually limit one's scope in a way that would not be ultimately helpful for learning as much as you can about the historical Jesus.
That's my sense. I mean, it's an interesting intellectual exercise. I don't think we'll ever actually we're
Mhm.
trying with another colleague there, Nathan Eubank. We're actually trying to organize an unpapal conclave to honor Father Meyer, but it's
Cool.
limited
Yes.
what you can actually get in that way. And but they're important conversations to have, obviously, to have different perspectives.
Yes. Yes. That sounds like a Netflix special, the unpapal conflict. I want to ask a really broad question. I don't know if I should have started with this. It's a
Mhm.
little bit theological, so you can answer it or not as you feel fit.
Mhm.
But I mean, I had a colleague. We were chatting here at Notre Dame about the I think I'm not 100% sure. It was something in the Old Testament. I think it was a conquest narrative of Canaan. So according to the biblical narrative, more or less,
Mhm.
Israelites come out of Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, cross the Jordan River, conquer Jericho, and then conquer the rest of, well, it takes a long time, but eventually more or less conquer Canaan. And so, the idea that the Israelites actually came Egypt and all at once kind of entered in that has been questioned by Old Testament scholars. I know it's not your field, but he said something like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter whether it happened because the very point of Scripture is that it's God's work to guide us to heaven. And so, who cares if Noah didn't exist, Abraham didn't exist, or the conquest of Canaan never happened? Scripture's purpose is not history. It's just, I think he called it a love song meant to sing us into heaven or something poetic like that. So,
Mhm.
any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of an evasion. I mean, I said we can. There's an asymmetry, and some of the problems that my Old Testament colleagues have to face aren't the same problems that we see in the New Testament. And
Yes,
I'd say
yes.
it does matter if Jesus really existed. It does matter if
Mhm.
Jesus really rose from the dead. There, Paul is quite right. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we are the most foolish of men.
Yeah,
So on
that's Paul himself said
that's
something like that. Yeah.
that's right. And there, I think both sides can probably agree. And honestly, I
Mhm.
mean, I can understand that. I have perfectly secular colleagues, and I understand. I mean, what a terrible what how high the stakes are, what the risk is of leading the world into error on one side or the other. I mean, a lot changes if this is true.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so to that extent, the question of the historicity of the Gospels. I mean, just to speak from the perspective of the Catholic Church. I mean, now shifting into a kind of magisterial mode. I mean, the commitments of the Church to the historicity of the Gospels are very very strong, profoundly strong. Um, and different, honestly, than the commitments to certain questions in the Old Testament, which isn't to say that it's all to be brushed aside. I think that's back to my analogy with Lepanto, where we need to think about the different ways that history is used, but also poetry and myth. I mean, yeah, there's a love song, but it's not all love song. There's also, chronicles and different types of texts and so forth there, and we need
That's
to
true.
find a place for
Yes.
all of that. But all of that, ultimately, I mean, through the messianic consciousness of Jesus, is bringing us to a kind of fulfillment that is a historical event. I mean, this is what, on the one hand, I think it can show to a certain extent, but there's things also that I think you can't show. I mean, this is also, I mean, a Christian perspective. I mean, it's not a scientific demonstration, the ascent of faith. So to that extent, I mean, I can bow a bit to Father Meyer in his understanding of the resurrection. I mean, it's one thing to try to prove with a kind of infallible certitude with historical tools. It's another thing just to defend historically, to talk about historically. Yeah, I mean, my belief isn't historically proven as false. So I mean, there's also different thresholds, that the project can recognize. Certain things we can kind of affirm, certain things we can kind of defend. But ultimately, there's an act of faith there that also needs to be acknowledged. There's a
Yes.
nice line,
Yes.
I think. He's a 19th century German Catholic theologian, in this case Müller, Johann Adam Müller, and he makes the point that the church isn't seeking. I mean, when we talk about the quest for the historical, the church isn't seeking Jesus as though it lost him. The church knows Jesus, and so
Request.
that's
Yes.
not what it is. That we're trying to prove something
Right.
that we're uncertain about, and so there's a particular kind of religious epistemology that theologically complex, that also
Mhm.
touches this entire question.
Much more to be spoken about there too, because there's presumably a Protestant style, probably a liberal Protestant style,
Right.
and a Catholic style to address all of this. There's a controversy, I think, in the field. I mean, it comes up in your 2022 book, A Quest for Historical Christ, a controversy around a scholar named Richard Bauckham,
Hmm.
who wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses.
Hmm.
I haven't read the book, so
Hmm.
I can't ask a really informed question. I just heard a little bit of, hey, I'm a chronic studies scholar anyway,
Right.
so that's my excuse. But I mean, I think he makes a robust claim that the Gospels, you can detect, I guess, through the language, I don't know, that you can see the signs that some of the accounts, presumably both narrative and sayings, come from eyewitnesses to those who heard the things, or I should put it that way, those who saw the things or heard the things. So,
Hmm.
I mean, what do you think about that? Do we have sort of direct eyewitness accounts in the New Testament?
I mean, that is a pretty important book, and controversial book. His Bauckham's central claim is about the Gospel of John, which presents itself as eyewitness. Okay,
Yes.
and one of the key things that Bauckham uh, displays there is the tradition in Greek history writing that this is very different from the way we think about history. That the most trustworthy account is the eyewitness account. We tend to think the more distance you have, the more critical historian you are.
Mhm.
In
Mhm.
the Greek tradition, I mean, you have basically Thucydides and Herodotus, or the kind of these two branches. But Thucydides is a player in the Peloponnesian War. He's an agent in it, and so he sees it from the inside. Josephus is inside the Jewish war when he writes it, and so the kind of informed, embedded reporter is the kind of highest form of history. And to that extent, there's a historical claim, a historiographical claim connected with this eyewitness claim, and you see that in a
In
different way.
John.
in John, one of the things I kind of expand on that in my book is he mentions the eyewitnesses in that preface that I mentioned, which is already a kind of signal that he's working in historiographical mode. He himself is not the eyewitness, but he's going to the eyewitness sources. So I do think that there's a very, very important signal here about the way in which both the Gospels are constructed and presented as reliable history. I mean, Luke uses this language as phaleia, but I mean it's trustworthy, it's reliable because it's based on witnesses, and this notion of witness is very, very foundational. So um, there's questions I think that can be posed once again about how direct the reporting is understood to be, and what we do with this notion of eyewitness as a kind of immediate translation into the accuracy of every detail or something like that, because there's a lot of narrative art that we need to make room for. So that may be a place where there's room for disagreement or discussion with Bauckham. But on the basic principle, I think it's a very important demonstration. And in its own way, it's a demonstration of something that, I mean, from a Catholic perspective, has never really been surrendered. There's been questions traditionally. Matthew's status as an eyewitness was very important. That has receded for a number of reasons, but the Johannine claims to eyewitness, and then the way that Luke works with this, I think, are important landmarks in our
Very interesting.
reconstruction of the
Yes.
history and the texts.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's important. Maybe, I mean, at least one general takeaway for those who may not read Bauckham's book is that, I mean, this is serious scholars who are talking about this question of eyewitness reports and the Gospels. This is not, some apologetic project or
Yeah,
something like that. So,
yeah.
if I can just to wrap up, ask you just two specific
Hmm.
uh, cases from the Gospels and how someone, what they say about the problems generally of reconstructing more or less what really happened
Hmm.
um, around Jesus. One is a case. There may be more famous contradictions, but this one kind of interests me because I think, I mean, maybe it's a red herring and it's easy to solve or something, but at the end of the Gospel of Luke, it's suggested in chapter 24, I think, maybe I got that wrong, someone will correct me,
Hmm.
that the ascension of Jesus after his resurrection takes place on the very same day of his resurrection. And then at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, the book that comes immediately after the four Gospels, traditionally understood by the same author as the Gospel of Luke, it seems like Jesus's ascension to heaven takes place 40 days after the resurrection. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to unravel that or speak about it, maybe just leave it as it is, or make a comment about contradictions generally.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, contradictions generally. There's a spectrum of. I mean, sometimes uh, the different wording in Luke and Matthew or something is presented as a contradiction. I think those are cases where we need to understand that narrative art is more at work, and that
Okay.
the exact words are not necessarily the aspiration of the authors in these contexts. So there's some things that sometimes go as contradictions that probably just need to be and can be more easily reconciled. The case, and a whole spectrum of these things, up to a case that like that you mentioned, which is a pretty challenging case. It's not, I mean, it's not red herring, because it's not entirely easy to solve that, and there's not an agreed on resolution to exactly how that works. It's
Mhm.
connected with the bigger discussion about the relationship between these two volumes, which, as you say, are traditionally attributed to both to the same author, to Luke. There's actually I have a colleague in Munich who just wrote an excellent book on this question of the unity of the two books, those two volumes,
Luke and Acts.
Luke and Acts, exactly.
Mhm.
And it's a question that's come up under kind of renewed discussion. I think a viable tentative way of thinking about how those books relate to one another and how those two scenes relate to one another, because they stand right at the juncture and the hinge between those two books, the very end of the
Hmm.
gospel, very beginning of Acts, is that
Hmm.
the kind of awkward transition from to one to the other has a little bit to do with the way in which the whole project was conceived, which wasn't necessarily. This is the view of this most recent study on this, wasn't necessarily conceived from the outset as a 2-volume work, and to that extent, there's a kind of independence to the gospel that's kind of rounded off. It's not wasn't originally imagined or designed to push right into a sequel or to need a sequel. So I think one of the ways to understand what the gospel is doing is it's finishing the story in a kind of
Hmm.
compact,
Hmm.
condensed way, because
Hmm.
it wants to be a complete thing, and
Hmm.
then the sequel begins and kind of expands, zooms in, if you want, and pulls apart that moment. So there,
Okay. Okay.
we could think about it as a kind of narrative art once again that has
Yes.
telescoped a particular event to give a kind of integral narrative character to the gospel.
To the
As
gospel. To the
such.
gospel. Luke.
Yeah. So I think
Yes.
that's one way to think about that. And that again, I think just at the level of principle shows us how necessary it is to think with a lot of nuance and precision about what the real textual narrative context of all these accounts might really be, because that's going to configure the way that the story is told.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Terrific. And then the last case, and the next to last question. Thank you for your patience with me. It's not a question of contradiction, but a rather theological
Hmm.
problem for the traditional view of Christ among Christians. Also, there's a connection here to Islamic Dawah
Hmm.
because Muslims will sometimes point out, actually, it's problematic for Islamic Christology too, but Muslims will sometimes point out that Christ on the cross is made to say in Matthew and Mark, I think, and this being a quotation of something from the Psalms, my God, why have you forsaken me? I forget if both Gospels quote this in Aramaic, so presumably they're
Hmm.
writing out Aramaic in Greek letters, Eloi, Eloi, lema
Hmm.
sabachthani. So obviously, folks always ask, like, wait, didn't Jesus know that, he was a savior, that he was the son of God, that he was going to rise from the dead? Why would he say this sort of thing?
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, how about dealing with this kind of problem, which seems so challenging for, the Messianic consciousness, you've used that phrase, but also just generally traditional Christian doctrine?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean it's a challenging moment. Obviously, it's the nadir of Jesus' entire experience. This is one of the things that obviously leads someone like Schweitzer to think that Jesus is a complete failure.
Mm.
He's waiting on God, and God abandons him because he has this, delusion, this kind of God delusion or self delusion. Um,
But
I
then
mean,
why would the gospel authors report it if they had a
yeah,
project to present him as Son of
yeah.
God, risen from the dead, glorious? So,
I think you put your finger right on something. Is there, again, we need to think, well, what's what's the gospel itself trying to do? I mean, these
right.
gospels are promoting a very, very different vision and of Jesus, and so I think we need to find a solution that makes sense in terms of what these authors are trying to do. That's where, I mean, again, I think this notion of Jesus finding himself not just in that isolated text or any isolated text, but this pattern of Jesus as kind of self-identifying with the fullness of Scripture, of Old Testament Scripture, is necessary as the grid to read that as well. So if we extract that and don't see that Jesus is actually entering into the entire experience of Israel, okay, the entire experience forecast by the prophets, then we're going to misread that particular dimension. It's a challenge dimension, but it's part of a bigger picture. And that's why on the other end of it, also at the end of Luke, in Luke 24, Jesus said, how slow of mind can you be? Wasn't it necessary that the Christ suffer these things and so enter into his glory? So this identification with the suffering just man of the Psalms, and if you read the entire Psalm, you also see that the suffering just man, who is also the suffering Israel, is always vindicated by God. I mean, that's the story of the
even
Old
in
Testament.
Psalm 22, what Jesus is quoting from on the cross.
Exactly. So whether it's just that psalm or the entire kind of story of the Old Testament, the identification with that figure, it's kind of Job figure, is a profound identification with the entire experience of God's elect, of God's chosen people. And to that extent, the vindication of God's elect, the vindication of those God has chosen, is part of the destiny. And so that's why the logic of entering into these things and so entering into the glory, or suffering these things and so entering into the glory, is being evoked here. And we need to just see that big logic as the basic logic of the whole Gospels and the whole logic of the Christian Bible as such, to plot that moment correctly.
Yes, great. Okay. Well, I mean, for me, one big takeaway is those who are really interested in understanding more the Jesus of history and working with the Gospels, our earliest texts, for understanding Jesus of history. I mean, it's more than just reading them carefully. Study has to be done about the whole world of first century Palestine. I mean, all that, as you know, there are people like you who, in your book, A Quest for the Historical Christ, make the task easier. But I mean, yeah, it just seems to me that's obviously very key to understand the style of histories, but also kind of the presuppositions, cultural presuppositions, religious presuppositions of Judaism at this period. So yeah, thank you so much. This was really terrific for me. It's coming from the outside, from Quranic studies, and I think the community for exploring the Quran and the Bible will be really grateful. Finally, Abuna, would you like to share anything about a new project you're working on? Things you'd like people to know about your work generally.
I have more projects than I wish I did. I'm working on the Apologist right now. So this is an interesting moment just in early Christianity, where the first Christians are trying to present their faith to a world that doesn't understand them, and I think in a lot of ways that's where we are again.
Yeah. So in that case, it's to more the pagan Mediterranean world where these apologists are working.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Terrific. Thank you so much, Father Anthony Giambrone, for being on Exploring the Quran and the Bible. And I hope I can convince you at some point to come back, and we'll do a second episode.
Thank you very much. Thank you.